Okay, class. So for our next and final lesson, we'll be talking about Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham Jail. So I'll start out by saying a few things about King's life to try to put it in biographical context. And then we'll jump into the letter itself. And we'll talk about the philosophical methods and strategy that King uses. We'll also talk about the strategy behind his nonviolent protests, what exactly he was trying to do. So his dates are here on the board, 1929 through 1968. He's born in Atlanta, Georgia, the son and grandson of Protestant ministers. And his father, in addition to being a minister, was an activist for African American rights at the time. When King was 6 years old, he had a best friend who was white, and the kids loved to play together. And he recalls being confused as to why it was that they had to go to separate schools. He thought, why can't we go to the same school together? And later on, the parents of that child said, you can't play with our son anymore because you're black and he's white. And this was just the first in a whole string of instances where Martin Luther King experienced the hatred and the segregation and the inequality that was a standard part of American life at the time. And that obviously would inform the things that he writes about in this letter and inform his life's work. He skipped the ninth grade and then went to college when he was only 15 years old. He also skipped his senior year of high school. He went to college when he was 15 years old. He was a promising scholar. He graduated when he was 19 and went into the seminary, intending to be a Protestant minister like his father and grandfather. He then went on to get a PhD in theology from Boston University, and it was there in particular that he studied a lot of philosophy, especially a lot of existentialism. Existentialism, which is the movement we've been studying recently, was the kind of, by this point, the prominent form or school of philosophy at the time. And King actually quotes in the letter of Birmingham Jail a series of prominent philosophers of the time, people like Paul Tillich and Martin Buber, etc., who were all very much part of this movement of existentialism. He then goes back to become a minister in a church in Montgomery, Alabama, at the age of 25. And it was there in Montgomery that Rosa Parks made her famous stand against being told to move to the back of the bus. And this led to the Montgomery bus boycotts, which King led. The success there catapulted King at a very young age to being a national leader for civic rights, and he formed this institution that he mentions in the letter, which is the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the idea behind that group was to have a series of members of the clergy be able to harness their moral authority as members of the clergy to try to work for injustice and an end to segregation, and specifically through nonviolent means. As part of that boycott, which went on for more than a year, King's house was bombed. And you can imagine what it's like. He's 26 years old, and he's working at his church, and he finds out that his house has been bombed while his wife and children are there. And again, King often writes about the temptation towards hatred. And he says, again and again, I was brought back to the sense of wanting to hate people. But as his father taught him, the proper response is not hatred, but love, and not violence, but nonviolence. To take this to the next level of sophistication and understanding of how this could actually work on a large scale, in 1959, King takes what he calls a pilgrimage to India to learn the methods of Gandhi. Gandhi, who was in part inspired by Thoreau's civil disobedience, harnessed the power of nonviolent protests to basically bring the British Empire to its knees in India, to great effect. And King wanted to know how could this work. He then returns to the United States, and in 1963, his group, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, goes to stage protests in Birmingham. And he knows that he will likely be arrested as we'll talk about later, being arrested is part of his civil disobedience, is part of what he was planning on. And so he's arrested there for peacefully protesting. And it's there while he's in jail that he writes this famous letter. And the people who put him in jail knew that there was this danger that he would try to write a letter from jail and thereby gather people to his cause. And so they denied him the right to have anything to write on or write with. But eventually somebody smuggled him a newspaper and a pencil. And he, in that newspaper, he reads this letter. It's an open letter by 8 white moderate clergy members who are very much on the side of civil rights, but they say, look, we believe in King's cause, but we disagree with his methods. We think that he's an extremist. We think he should simply wait and let justice play itself out. And we think that he is increasing rather than decreasing the racial tensions here. And moreover, he's not from around here, right? He's from Atlanta. Why doesn't he just go back to Atlanta and worry about injustices in Atlanta? Again, it's pretty clear that King, although he's responding in a very loving way and writing a letter back, you can read between the lines, you see the anger there. And one of the things that he says in the letter, he talks about white moderates, and I'll read this to you. This is several pages in. He says, "I must confess that over the past few years, I've been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I've almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Right? And so this is one of the main things that he is trying to confront in these protests themselves and in the letter that he writes. Is how to frame the struggle for freedom and equality and an end of segregation in a way that it becomes a call to conscience for all Americans. And that people who would prefer to say, well, yeah, I'm on your side, but I think you're an extremist, he wants to convince them that he is justified in the methods that he's using and in the urgency of his cause. And so that's really the main point of this letter. He eventually gets out of jail and he publishes it as an open letter. Let's talk about the philosophical context behind this. So one thing I've already mentioned Thoreau and his essay Civil Disobedience. Many people think it's certainly where the term civil disobedience comes from. And many people would say that's the origins of this whole concept. Thoreau talks about what he calls a peaceable revolution, which in his case was simply not paying his taxes in protest of the Mexican-American War. Thoreau envisions this as the kind of thing that on one hand keeps your hands clean insofar as you're not contributing to an injustice, but Thoreau also envisions it would be possible if everybody stopped paying their taxes to end this unjust war. But that idea of an effective nonviolent protest was very much in doubt. This seemed like a somewhat bizarre idea, both in Thoreau's time and in King's time. And a lot of people thought that Martin Luther King was essentially acquiescing to injustice. And by not condoning violence, he was basically kind of trying to wash his hands of it and saying, look, I'm going to maintain my own moral purity here by not being unjust and not being violent. But a lot of people said King doesn't really care about the cause of civil rights. If he did, he would be more involved. He would condone violence. And a lot of people said, you're not going to get anywhere in this world by matching violence against you with nonviolence. They thought this was just completely ineffective. And it's important to, especially now, these days, we look back on Martin Luther King as a kind of saint, and we know the great accomplishments that followed. But I think it's important to kind of be able to put yourself back in his shoes and to see this was a leap of faith for him. The idea that this could be effective. And towards the end of his life, he started to worry that maybe it wasn't working. And I might say throughout his whole life, he was kind of always in a struggle, hoping this would work, hoping that nonviolence would be effective. The next thing to talk about is the results of this. So after Birmingham, he has his famous March on Washington, where he gives his I Have a Dream speech. And then shortly thereafter, you have, in 1964, the Civil Rights Act, and then the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So it's clear when we look back now that this was effective. And we now look back on Martin Luther King as a kind of national hero. But it's important to bear in mind that even after these accomplishments, a large segment of the American population did not have a positive view of Martin Luther King. They thought that he was an agitator. They thought that he was causing trouble, bringing, as we mentioned before, that he was increasing racial tensions rather than decreasing them. And so it's kind of important to understand, to put ourselves back in that moment in 1963 in Birmingham, to try to see things from King's perspective and to see how he's arguing these things. The next thing to talk about in terms of the context behind this is that although we think of Thoreau as kind of beginning this concept of civil disobedience, one of the interesting things that King does is he says, actually, civil disobedience has been around for thousands of years. And he brings a whole series of examples. He says, for example, Jesus was practicing civil disobedience. Socrates was practicing civil disobedience. And in fact, he evokes Socrates several times throughout this letter. He also tries to put his protest in the context of the great American struggle for freedom. So he talks a lot about people like Jefferson and Franklin and the Founding Fathers. And he tries to locate what he's doing in the context of that struggle for freedom. And one of the things that he brings up in terms of a case of civil disobedience is the Boston Tea Party, where people threw casks of tea into the ocean to protest the British and their taxes. And you can see from that what King wants to show is this is very much a part of American history. It's very much a part of a history of great thinkers and leaders who've changed the world through their conscientious action. And he wants Americans to kind of see what's happening here as the next chapter of that. So all this goes back to some of the things we talked about last time in terms of Camus. For one thing, the sense of the struggle that keeps repeating itself. The idea that there's always, at every moment, the next struggle against injustice and evil. And that within that struggle, you're saying a no against that, but you're also saying a yes. And there's a kind of an affirmative act, a message of dignity, respect for others, freedom, those kinds of things. And this is exactly what comes through in King's work. So on one hand, he's very much criticizing a series of people from moderates to the extreme KKK. But on the other hand, you see that he's trying to uphold a positive vision of what it is that he is doing and what it is that he's fighting for. The next thing to talk about in terms of this context is Socrates. As I said, Socrates he evokes 3 times throughout this letter, more than any other figure. And one of the things that he says in referencing Socrates is he says, this idea of creating tension and that as a bad thing, he says that's exactly what civil disobedience is trying to do. And he says this is exactly what Socrates did. And King evokes that metaphor of the gadfly here. And he says just as Socrates was a gadfly who bit the horse of the Athenian people to try to wake it up out of its complacency with vice, so too he's saying, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to kind of wake people up and give them a call to conscience in exactly the way that Socrates did. So as I said, his main target here within the letter are people who would agree with his cause but disagree with these methods and say that he is an extremist and that he's an outside agitator. And so let's jump into the text there. In the first few pages, that's the first objection to what he's doing that he addresses, this idea that he's an outside agitator. He gives a kind of technical explanation. First of all, he says, look, my organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, we cover the whole South, and so, yeah, this is within our domain. We're not outsiders here. But his much more substantial answer, the one that probably all of you have heard quoted before, is where he says, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Never again can we afford to live with the narrow provincial outside agitator idea. Anyone who lives in the United States can never be considered an outsider anywhere within its bounds. right? So one of the main things that he's trying to address here is it's not just those white Southern clergymen who wrote the letter that he's immediately responding to. One of the main things he's trying to do is awaken the conscience of people in the northern and in western states for whom segregation seems to be a foreign problem, a different problem, not one that they are immediately confronting or part of. Because what was happening is a lot of people were saying, look, yeah, obviously people in the South, they're backward, they're racist. Yeah, of course segregation is evil, but they said that's not really my problem, right? I'm living in Massachusetts, I'm living in Wyoming, right? We don't have those laws. What King wanted to show is it is your problem. It's everybody's problem. And he says, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, meaning there's no way that you can kind of isolate yourself from other people and the injustices foisted against them. We are all, as he says, tied in one garment, right? We might say we're all in one boat together. And here he's very much echoing exactly what Thoreau says in his essay, Civil Disobedience, where Thoreau says, my quarrel is not with the slave owners in the South, even though, of course, what they're doing is evil. My quarrel is with moderates here in Massachusetts who say that they're opposed to slavery and yet support it through their trade and the taxes they pay, etc. Right? So this is part of what King is trying to get at, is everybody in America, we are all in one boat. And whatever affects some of us directly by having their rights denied, he says, that can affect each person indirectly. But moreover, he's really trying to get people to care and have a sense of conscience about injustices everywhere, such that that everybody needs to get involved. And in many ways, this is one of the most effective things that King does. He made civil rights go from being a localized issue in the South, of struggles between whites and blacks in the South, to being a national issue, and in many ways, the national issue of the time. So for your first reflection, I want you to look back at this idea, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Now, if you read to the end of that, he makes it clear that within his context, he's talking about everywhere in the United States of America. But my first reflection question for you is, first of all, do you agree with what he's saying, that that injustice to anybody in America is everybody in America's problem? But then moreover, I want you to reflect on, could this be expanded in a global sense? Could you say that injustice anywhere in the world is a threat to justice everywhere in the world, such that we here in America should care about and involve ourselves in eradicating injustice and bigotry, hatred, violence against innocent people elsewhere in the world? Or do you think that, no, this can be localized to America, where we should deal with injustices within America, but that it's not our task to get involved with ending injustices elsewhere in the world? And if it helps to give examples, please do so.